Top of the morning to ye, Dan.
Or it's middle of the morning, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't
Well,
know.
it's pandemic times. This is top.
Pandemic times.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody.
Good morning,
Great
everybody.
to be with you again. And here we are.
Yeah, we're returning to a theme. We've talked about trauma before. We're actually talking about trauma from a different angle on Monday, and today we're specifically talking about trauma and its relationship with contemplative practice, which came up from a great comment at the end of one of our most recent episodes, where Lena Gardner asked, "How do you engage in contemplation if you're part of an oppressed group or experience trauma because stuff comes up?"
Right. And so, Lena, I don't know if you're with us today, but if you are, that's great. And if not, you can listen later. But thanks for this idea. Yeah. So to just kind of kick off the conversation, again, this point of whatever traumas we are holding, and a friend of mine who's a great spiritual teacher, a very wise woman, once said to me, well, all of humanity has PTSD. And obviously there's variations and degrees of that, but there is this sense that having an ego self is a traumatic experience. And so whatever traumas that we are holding or we have experienced, when we begin to engage contemplative practice, which again is just the use of our mind to directly observe reality, these traumas come up, they appear in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
And so the issue really is, how do we work with that, and what happens when that occurs. So that's what we want to talk a little bit about, both from a kind of how-to point of view, and also from the point of view of what that experience is like.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of complexity to this, and I think there's also part of the challenge is, I think a lot of us, when we encounter contemplative practice, it comes in this prepackaged idea of what it's supposed to be. Right. And it tends to be very monolithic. And it's like it's one of three practices, and you have to do it a certain way. And if you don't, there's something wrong with you. That's kind of like often the assumption. And so that it's not very communal. It's not very customizable. We don't think about it that way. So then if all of a sudden you're just like, you need to do this in order to be holy, I mean, it's setting people up for their, just another kind of religious trauma.
Right, and the other way that it often comes packaged is this is really positive.
Yes,
right? This is supposed to make you feel good. It's supposed to make you feel peaceful. This is supposed to center yourself. Right? We have this whole type of contemplative practice called centering prayer, which of course implies that you're supposed to get centered, right? And so, then people start doing these things and all hell breaks loose, basically. And, we do not experience all those wonderful things. And then especially if we're trying to do it alone, or we took one class and then we're trying to do it by ourselves, basically this generates a huge amount of pain and confusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm wondering maybe if you want to share your story. That seems like a great framing.
Right. Yeah. So one of the and again, as Mark said, the issue is very complicated and multi-layered, and there are a lot of different traumas. But one example that I had of this, which was actually my first real introduction to religious trauma, was. For a number of years, I was the co-director of a program, a contemplative program, this national program called the Sabbath Retreats. And what we were doing was teaching contemplative practice to youth ministers. And we were doing this several different sites around the country. And it was a great activity. And the basic model It was a 5-day retreat. They would learn a lot of different prayer practices, and it was terrific. And over the years, what we noticed was that there was a group of people that would come back. They would want to do it again. There was some seeming interest in going deeper. And so we decided to create what we called Sabbath 2. And the idea of that was that it was going to be more intensive practice together in community. And so basically it was just silent prayer. I wanted to do 8 hours a day, but the staff revolted and said that was too much. So we were only doing 4, which they also thought was too much, but that was fine. So we were doing this together, and we started out. And basically what happened was that this incredible amount of these people's religious trauma, negative images of God came up. And people got really distressed. It was very, very difficult. I mean, people were having panic attacks. People were just super confused, very concerned. Then, of course, my staff started sort of revolting, because now people weren't spiritual and happy. They were really distressed. So that distressed the staff. And we really had to work with this in a very concentrated and effortful way. But it was a great example of how trauma arises when you have and give yourself all of this space. Mm-hmm. Now, the good news is that, and this was something that I kept trying to reassure, particularly the staff, throughout these 5 days, was that what does happen is that as you continue to engage the practice together in community, there's a lot of healing that goes on. And that sort of ego state that is solidified as a result of the trauma begins to dissolve and relax, and you begin to get to a more positive place. Mm-hmm. And so by the end of the week, a lot of this resolved, and it was really great to see that. But it was a perfect example of how these contemplative practices are very powerful tools, and we need to respect them and work with them in a way that is healthy and helpful.
Yeah, and my experience, I'm assuming there's statistically a decent percentage of the people watching who come from evangelical or fundamentalist backgrounds, mm-hmm. Where spiritual practices, I was told, you need to do these things. That's how you get sanctified. Okay, you're saved, but if you want to get right, you have to do these things, and you need to do them the right way. And so there's a sense of ought that gets baked into it. And all of a sudden now you're given this, but it's clear, what you're supposed to do. You pray certain ways. They give you an acronym to pray a certain way. And then you have to read the Bible. So it's clear. And then you're told that's your relationship with God. Now then all of a sudden you get thrown into now you just have to be silent for 30 minutes. And you need to center yourself and listen to God. That can be terrifying, because there's no right way to do that. Mm-hmm. At all. Mm-hmm. That's not how it works. And so if you're somehow trying to perform resting for 30 minutes in the presence of God, all kinds of performance anxiety, or you find yourself bored and you feel guilty for being bored, or you have this idea that you're supposed to be experiencing something, we're not, a lot of us weren't equipped to be able to do that. And so because we don't know any better, we think, oh, I'm just screwing up. And then it brings all this sort of trauma of failure surging out.
Well, or the experiences we start having are really, really difficult, mm-hmm. right?
Start thinking about things you don't want to be thinking about or feeling.
Yeah. And so one image that I often share with people is, we've all seen these cartoons about the closet that's full of stuff, right? And the little cartoon figure opens the closet door and all the stuff falls out on you and mm-hmm. sort of buries you. And I think that that's actually a great image for what sort of happens with contemplative practice, right? So that the traumas, pains, hurts, confusion, difficulties, we all sort of stuff that in a closet. Usually, the closet's then somewhere in our bodies.
Mhm.
And so contemplation is sort of like opening the closet door, right? We just give a lot of space to ourselves, and this stuff falls out on our head, and it can be really difficult. And so right, if you're told, oh, this is about getting close to God, and suddenly just all of our junk falls out on our head, yeah, that's not good. That does not,
Mhm.
it doesn't feel good. We don't know what to do with that. We don't know how to work with it. Um, and again, this is where, uh, and this is why contemplative life and practice was not meant to be done by yourself.
Mhm.
There's a very, very small percentage of people who are truly called to be hermits. And we see this historically, even, right? That the Desert Mothers and Fathers movement, which was this hermit movement into the desert, basically began to evolve into a community movement because people could not do this by themselves. And and so it was out of that movement that the original Christian communities began to form.
Mhm.
And they actually began to form before the rules were created. We've heard about Benedict, and some people have heard about the rule of Pacoimus and some of these early community rules. But even in the desert, and there are these interesting archaeological sites where you see the caves of the hermits look like beehives. Everybody is clumped next to each other. And obviously, they were forming these communities of support to pray together.
Uh, we've got a comment that came up, and this is tying into what we were talking about a little earlier. Connie writes, I had two women who worked with me for 2 hours to be able to speak in tongues, or I would not make it through seminary.
Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry, Connie. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a lot of our experiences with spirituality are one of conformity to a certain sort of expectations that tend to have like this authoritarian, like relating to God as authority figure primarily. And so you have to measure up. And so that gets really traumatic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Kathleen's having some technical difficulties. I'm sorry that you
yeah.
are.
She can't
But
hear anything. I don't think
yeah.
anybody else is having that issue. So not that I'm hoping you can't hear us because it's your stuff, but hopefully it's not everyone experiencing a lack of being able to hear Kathleen. But um,
Um,
I'm going to bring up another issue that I think maybe gets into more of the systemic traumas. Like, and we were
mhm.
talking about beforehand, like I'm reluctant to speak to the experience of trauma of historically marginalized or exploited peoples because that's not my experience, but I can talk from a place of some class triggers, which is something I do feel anxiety around. And one of the things that I see in a lot of contemplative spaces, contemplation, it doesn't have to be upper middle class, white bourgeois spirituality,
Right.
but we know that it kind of sometimes is. It's packaged that way for
Mhm.
reasons so if you go into a space that you're kind of need to be vulnerable, um, and you're finding it's mostly seemingly fairly well-to-do white people who are very, very polite all the time. Politeness can be a trigger for people because it's like when you're with friends, like not everyone who's lower class, but like class, there tends to be this thing like people who are friends with, you're vulnerable with, you talk casually and honestly and vulnerably, and then politeness is for how you relate to people in the business world. So if you go into this spiritual space where everyone is performing kindly in a polite sort of veneer way, it can be very anxiety producing.
Yep.
um, and that's part of
Yeah.
it. That's part of the reality. It's centered on for a lot of practitioners, it tends to center on white upper middle class sensibilities.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. So Becky says she has other issues today, but not on the technical side. Haha. Nice to see you here, Becky. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, so this comment from Lacey, do it, talk about Lacey, or maybe Lace. Yeah, so I think that one of the places that we see exactly what we're talking about in terms of historically marginalized communities, a lot of folks in Black activist spaces, for example, will talk about we'll talk about, we need space that is our space to process these traumas, right? And then, of course, some white folks get really ticked off about this and feel all offended or something for reasons that, I mean, I can understand, but I can't really understand. But I think that process gets to the heart of this, right? That if you are processing traumas, if you are allowing these traumas to come out, if you are looking for healing, you need a community space that is a safe space for you to be able to do that. And that's what a practice space does, right? It is literally a holding container that is strong enough for you to sort of explode, right? And that you're safe there. You're going to be held by these other people. I mean, I remember, as I was preparing for this, I was kind of thinking back to my early days of contemplative practice. And I remember when I went to build this monastery, and this was really my first experience of extremely intensive contemplative practice. And I remember, I mean, all of this stuff from my childhood, I mean, my brain was literally exploding, and I had these voices screaming in my head, and my parents were screaming at me, and society was screaming at me. And I mean, it was horrible. It was horrible. It was really, really hard. And the container of the community there and the work that we were doing there allowed me to simply be present to that, and to move through it, and to heal from it, and to understand it more deeply. But if I was like out in regular alienated society, like having to just do my regular stuff, that would not have been workable, right? And so, so the container of a contemplative space, whatever that is, and whether that's a community of practice, whether that's having a therapist, having a spiritual director, those are the kinds of things that allow us to do this very challenging work.
It's a couple of good comments here. I'm going to start with Lace's. It's not just about politeness. She corrected this later in another comment, I don't think. It's about the disingenuousness, but you sometimes feel underneath the surface that makes it an unsafe space. If we're going to talk about this kind of thing that we talked about, the safety of the space itself, I agree. And that's, right, to me, I think that's what I wanted to get at with the politeness thing. It's not like I want people to be rude, but sometimes you just get the feeling that politeness is a veneer to cover over stuff. Yeah. And it can be very anxiety producing when you're like, how do I know who's being real here? Who can I trust? Yeah, and then Maria, just to jump back up to one talking about earlier practices, I get a lot of contemplation working in my garden.
Right.
You want to say something about that, Dan?
Well, just that, yeah. I mean, so again, contemplation. There's a whole range of practices, and just to do a little promotional plug here, which I hardly ever do, right? So my book, Creating a Life with God, looks at 12 different types of practices, one of which is praying in nature. And so, yes, I mean, meditating in the garden is a very, very ancient, well-worn type of contemplative practice. And Lace has another great comment. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly.
Lace has a Facebook page called Lace on Race, so I'm assuming that's a rhyme. So but yeah, if we're saying your name wrong, Lace, please correct us. We don't want to butcher your name. The problem there is that white people are afraid of black people exploding. If that happens, I'll shut it down. So it needs to be a container that's safe enough for everyone to be able to explode or implode even.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
yeah, that's again that sort of white middle class consciousness thing. Like it's one of the reasons I'm glad. Like, so I grew up in a charismatic / Pentecostal sort of rural church experience where the most stoic Germanic farmers would come, and then like on Sundays though, because it's the thing, we'd have to move the chairs back, and then people would get all sweaty dancing. And there was a lot of complexity and negativity about that. But I learned like it's okay if people were weeping or sobbing. So even though it's hard for me in certain ways, a stoic white person to like express, I learned that that's part of spirituality. And so when I move into these spaces where it's like it feels so restrained, it's just a bummer to me.
Right. Well, yeah, and what you're describing, Lace, right, is that is the systemic ego habit of whiteness, right? Like whiteness cannot tolerate, having a black person get upset. What and so again, contemplation seeks to create a community container where all of the ego habits, both the personal ego habits and the social ego habits, the systemic ego habits, can begin to dissolve, right? And we have to be able to create those containers to tolerate that, but we generally don't. Yeah, and if anybody wants to see a great example of this that's hilarious, search for the video Gandhi goes to a yoga class. Okay, so Gandhi goes to a yoga class. It's absolutely great, and it kind of gets it in a light way at some of the issues we've been talking about here.
I want to just jump back to Maria's comment. Like one of the things in doing spiritual direction is a lot of people will come and they'll sort of have this feeling of disappointment because they're not doing these practices the way they ought to. And then I try to remind them, like, of course, not in some ways, everything can be contemplative. And in some ways, like, you just don't want to call everything contemplative either. Like there's a balance there. But for me, my favorite contemplative practice is walking through my neighborhood, not even like trying, like the only thing when I'm walking is just I try to not be in my head and just pay attention. Like I'm not trying to memorize Thich Nhat Hanh quotes about mindfulness and attentiveness. I'm not trying to do anything. And so I think I try to look at it as like I'm not trying to live up to certain practices. I'm trying to live down into being just in my body and being present. To me, that's what the core of contemplation. And so when we start finding ourselves like in our head anxiously trying to live up to something, I feel like that, for me at least, that causes all sorts of anxiety. And so gardening, walking, making a meal, there's all sorts of things that if we can be present to it, just really present and attentive to it, I think it's a great practice.
Right. Yeah, and one little nice slogan about what contemplation is, right? It's that we have an intention to pay attention. And so so really anything, and yes, this can be over exaggerated and overblown, but it is really true that any activity can become a contemplative practice. But it really has to do with what is the attitude we are bringing to this, and then again, what is the wider container that we're somehow a part of, that can help us work with and process what comes up, because stuff is going to come up. I mean, there's no question about that.
That's right.
And
just for those who are maybe started late or tuning out, we've got about 6 minutes left, and but Dan and I are talking about the relationship between trauma and contemplation. What does contemplative practice offer for those who have experienced or are experiencing personal or systemic trauma? And I mean, this question of trauma, being trauma-aware contemplation, it's a big thing because religion has a lot of trauma in it. And then people tend to think of contemplation as some sort of medicinal wellness thing. which it is that, but it's deeper than that. And so I think people fall into the pit with this one a lot.
Mm-hmm. But I also think that on a very basic level, this is so important to talk about, and it really is something that is generally not discussed. I mean, there was another community that we were a part of for a while, and the main kind of teachers, writers in that community, basically all their stuff sounded like contemplation was just all rainbows and unicorns and totally blissful. And I remember there was one time, when we were living at this community, and so there was this guy that was visiting from Australia, and he wasn't having a blissful time at all. I mean, he was just miserable, and then the place that we were in had this really big staircase, and this very smooth floor on the landing, and he was coming down the staircase one morning, and he like slipped and fell on his back. And he was talking to us about it later, and he said, I'm reading all this stuff about how great contemplation is, and I'm going crazy. And then I slipped on the staircase, and I thought, terrific, I'm going to be killed at a contemplative retreat. And again, part of what he was expressing was just this basic frustration that nobody was offering any teaching about the fact that this was hard and things were coming up, and that is actually normal and to be expected. And the environment and the teachers and the community need to help people with that.
Yeah, and I think that we see this in contemplation. I see it in a lot of spirituality. It's kind of this positivity veneer. One of the things, I've been doing morning exam, and one of the steps in it is receiving the day with gratitude. And every time I've ever heard mostly people talk about gratitude, it's like kind of this count your blessings and don't be negative kind of thing. And I'm like, no, that's not what it is. So I've been in a way that seems negative, maybe I've been very clearly saying, to me, to receive this day with gratitude is an act of defiance. Because there's a lot of things that I don't feel grateful about, but I'm hoping in defiance that God is present today. Good things are possible, that I can experience blessings and presence. And so with that, I offer gratitude, like this kind of real honest appraisal of where things are at, which oftentimes spirituality, like for some reason we think that somehow it's less valid if we don't name those things, or that being ungrateful or crabby is somehow less spiritual. I mean, read the freaking Bible. It's filled with this stuff. So why do we think that our spirituality shouldn't be like that now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we're coming down towards the end. We've had some really great comments.
Great comments and questions.
If you have any other thoughts, reflections, comments, sorry if there have been some technical difficulties, but I know some of you are not experiencing that.
Yes, I think the new Olympic game is gratitude. Well, I definitely get a workout trying.
Well, no, I mean, what I was thinking when we were talking about that, Mark, was a conversation that we were having somewhere a little while back that that often, you have this feeling that spirituality, or you're being told that spirituality has to begin with joy or something positive. And
yeah, I've gotten pushback that it always starts with joy and awe and wonder. Yeah.
Right. And what you said was that, from your perspective, spirituality begins with suffering, which certainly, is actually much more biblically accurate in a lot of ways. But yeah, I mean, it's, and that is something, again, about contemplation, is that we deeply experience the truth of our suffering. And really all spiritual traditions have talked about that, but I guess that doesn't sell Lululemon yoga pants.
It does not.
It does not.
No, it doesn't. And yeah.
One of my teachers, and I joke about this all the time as bad marketing slogans for contemplation. I mean, one of my teachers would say that contemplation was basically about boredom and disappointment.
That's most of what human experience can be like.
Yeah.
If you're not distracting yourself.
Right. And so it's like, I always say, this is a great marketing slogan. Come meditate with us. It's boring and disappointing.
I often, as a parent, like I tell my son all the time, boredom is good. Great things come out of boredom.
Right.
And right now, our society is kind of built in some ways to distract us from things, including boredom, and there's a detriment to that. And
Yeah.
I think, contemplation is the opposite of being distracted. I mean, in a lot of ways. So of course you're going to be bored, and that's okay. And it's not only just okay; it's actually good.
Right.
Being
Yep.
bored is like a necessary part of spirituality to me. Susan writes, "Thank you. Glad I could join for this episode today on my day off."
Great. Well, thanks for joining us, Susan.
Yeah, that's a good point to end, is on a note of gratitude. And then, Key writes, "I got on late. This topic is of great interest to me." These are always live, but they're always, archived in a number of places, including the transmission. If you look up transmission video on Facebook, you'll find this page. We've got them there. We've also got it on the Center for Prophetic Imagination Facebook page and YouTube, and then also the Minnesota Institute for Contemplation and Healing Facebook page. They're there. They're great enjoyment to your life if you just spend all your waking moments in the pandemic watching and rewatching old episodes.
Yep.
Yeah, so you can experience boredom
and spiritual boredom. You will experience spiritual boredom.
Yes.
So we really appreciate you hanging out with us, and for all the people that have listened and come by. And Monday, we've got another great guest. Super excited about that. So Shen Holcraft is going to be joining us from Boulder, Colorado. Shen is a psychotherapist there, a longtime friend of ours, and we're really looking forward to exploring more specifically what we're noticing about religious trauma in this time.
We'll hopefully see a lot of you, or see your comments at least, on Monday, and enjoy the weekend in Minnesota, where we've had snow. It's still melting. It's going to be a great weekend. So this is a nice time to get in, maybe into some nature contemplation.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we've been doing in response to the pandemic is I've been finding all these nature areas that are less well known, and going out and just walking and meditating, and there's hardly anybody out there. So perfect social distancing.
Sounds good.
See ya.
See ya.